talks. So I'm really very glad to welcome all of you on board for the fourth session on the Global Public Policy series. I'm extremely sorry my network is not very well, so I might just switch off my video. I'm Palak Sharma, and it's a great occasion today that we are on the fourth session of the Global Public Policy Program 2021. This program is by Center for Policy Studies at J.K. Lakshmipat University and in collaboration with the School of Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, for today's session. Today, we have two very relevant themes. The first one being using carbon pricing to achieve an equitable energy transition, and the second one being controlling corporate power by two very eminent professors from UMass Amherst, Professor Michael Ashe and Professor Lenore Palladino. I hope I've been correct in the pronunciation, but really sorry if I've been wrong. Today, we also have Professor Alasdair Roberts with us, the director of the School of Public Policy at UMass. Professor Al has been very kind enough to be co-hosting today's session with me, and we also give him a very warm welcome. I am the program manager for the LSEF UMass Scholarship Program. We select a cohort of exceptional scholars every year and offer them a generous scholarship to pursue a master's in public policy or resource economics or data analytics and computational social science, with first year at J.K. Lakshmipat University in India and the second year at UMass Amherst. The lectures today are a part of the series which will comprise of 5 power-packed and interactive sessions by some of the most inspiring and accomplished faculty and public policy professionals from UMass Amherst. Now, I would like to welcome both our eminent speakers. The first speaker amongst us is Professor Michael Ashe. Professor Ashe, along with being at the School of Public Policy, is also at the Department of Economics, is also affiliated with the Political Economy Research Institute, PERI, where he collaborates on the Corporate Toxic Information Project and uses EPA data to track the exposure of communities to pollution hazards. He is the co-author with Francisca Lauca of Shadow Networks, Financial Disorders and the System That Caused Crisis, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. He has written numerous articles on topics including environmental justice, unionization, and public debt. Professor received a grant from the National Institutes of Health to support his research on the relationship between hospital labor unions, wage, and patient safety. Ashe was a Fulbright Fellow in Budapest, Hungary, and served as a staff labor economist with the Council of Economic Advisor. Professor received a UMass Amherst Outstanding Accomplishment and Research Award and a College of Social and Behavioral Sciences Outstanding Teaching Award, and was named one of Foreign Policy's 100 leading global thinkers. He has a PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley, and an AB in economics from Princeton Universities. We now welcome Professor Lenore Palladino amongst us. She's an assistant professor at the School of Public Policy and the Department of Economics and a research associate at the UMass Amherst Political Economy Research Institute, as well as the fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. Professor holds a PhD from the New School University in Economics and a JD from Fordham Law School. Professor Palladino is a contributing editor at the Boston Review and a fellow at the Rutgers Institute for Employee Ownership. Professor Palladino's research centers on corporate power, stakeholder corporations, shareholder primacy, and the relationship between corporate governance and the labor market. Professor has also written on financial transaction taxes, employee ownership, and the rise of fintech. She frequently works with policymakers, media, and advocates on corporate and financial policy, and her recent working papers include The Economic Argument for Stakeholder Corporations and Do Corporate Insiders Use Stock Buybacks for Personal Gain? We now welcome both of them for today's session with a very warm heart and request them to begin today's session. I would first request Professor Michael Ashe to begin with his session, which is going to be a very informative session for all of us and enlighten us more towards reading more, studying more about public policy in context of climate change. Thank you for being here, sir. It's over to you.
Great. Thank you, Palak Sharma, for a very generous and warm introduction. I hope everyone can hear me. Signal me if not. And I'm honored to be in conversation with all of you at J.K. Lakshmipat University. I've learned more about J.K. Lakshmipat. It's a very exciting university, and it's in a very important global location. So I'm really honored to be here. I'm going to talk about something that I've prepared on the climate crisis. Let me begin by sharing my screen, and I have a number of slides. So the climate crisis might be the world's biggest commons problem, because in the case of greenhouse gases, the aggregation of many individual actors pursuing individual self-interest has led not to broad social benefits, the promise of the so-called invisible hand, but to an ecosystemic crisis. Some people despair and can envision survival only with radical austerity or ruthless authoritarianism. But I think lessons from the world's many well-managed commons offer solutions that can enhance well-being and save the planet. So that's our goal. So our energy system. Everyone likes the benefits of a robust and reliable energy system. Agriculture, the food that we eat, requires tractors, fertilizer, chemicals. Our houses should be comfortable in winter and in summer. Transportation, flying and driving take us where we need to go and where we want to go. Electricity, everything from street lights to video games, we spend a lot of our lives plugged in. And of course, industry is at the core of modern production. So we love those things. But the energy that we've been using, as you can see in the lower left-hand panel of this slide, comes overwhelmingly from fossil fuel sources, from petroleum, from natural gas, from coal. And those turn out to be greenhouse gases. You can see on the right-hand side, the end uses. These are the things that we like. These are the things we like and we need. But there is a significant consequence. And that consequence is that introducing carbon dioxide rapidly from fossil fuels into the atmosphere is creating a climate crisis. You can see here rising temperatures over the modern period, really taking off dramatically in the post-World War II period. We've broken the sources of this into natural drivers, which really are not the issue. And the problem is we have human-generated climate change, which threatens ecosystems and indeed the survival of many species, including ours, around the planet. So we have ourselves a very significant global problem. Everybody needs and likes the products of our energy system, but the energy system is posing a grave existential threat. We can have different lenses on national responsibility for the climate crisis. So if you look on the left-hand side, we have each country's share of contemporary 2020, so last year, national emissions. And so you can see two interesting wedges that happen to be right next to each other. We have the United States responsible for 15% of global emissions, and we have India responsible for roughly half the share of the United States, about 7%. So this is one lens on countries' share of CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions that are causing the climate crisis. Let me show you a couple of different lenses. This is one lens, but let's move to the right one slide. And here we have carbon dioxide emissions per capita. So although there are significantly different numbers of people in India and in the United States. So if we look per capita, we'll see that the United States has roughly 16 and a half metric ton, 16.5 tons per capita of annual carbon dioxide emissions. India, we have a nice selection of countries here, has about 1/10 that. And so the average Indian citizen contributes about 1/10 the amount of carbon dioxide per year that the average US citizen does. The United States is particularly gluttonous when it comes to carbon dioxide emissions. because of the character, character of our electrical energy system, the amount of driving and single-family automobiles that the United States has. You'll see we're up there with a trio of settler colonial countries, the United States, Australia, and Canada. European countries have made more of an energy transition, and you'll see that India does not, in fact, produce a large quantity of greenhouse gases per capita. We can apply yet another lens. So this is contemporary. We can apply another lens on this question, and we can take a look at the cumulative contribution to CO2 emissions. Coal was at the heart of the Industrial Revolution. It began in Britain, then later other parts of Europe and the United States. And so if you look historically, you'll see here again, we have the United States, a very large contribution to the cumulative load of greenhouse gases. And here is the rather small contribution of more recently accelerating its development, India. So there are different lenses that we can use on national contributions. And negotiating this between countries can be a rather sticky point. That's not what I'm going to focus on today. On the contrary, today I want to focus on what countries can do for themselves that can be a very, very effective way to address climate change. So what are we looking for in climate policy? Here's a rule of thumb for effective climate policy. We need to keep enough fossil fuel in the ground, coal that we do not burn, oil that we do not put in our tanks, to prevent global temperatures from rising more than about 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial. So we can judge policy on whether it does that. Let me remark here that individual action cannot address the climate crisis. You cannot shop for a better world. You cannot fast. Austerity is not a path to saving the planet. There are too many people who need and want the things that a robust and resilient energy system brings us. So you might worry, do we have ourselves an insurmountable free rider problem? Nobody wants to unilaterally reduce greenhouse gases. It costs the reducer, a household or a country, but it costs all of the benefits. You forego the transportation, you forego the industry, you forego the comfortable heating and cooling of your house, but it doesn't really make a dent in emissions. So it is a free rider problem. You individually will forego all those benefits, but it's not enough to solve the problem. And here are 3, I think, reasons for hope. This is not a gloomy talk. On the contrary, this is a highly optimistic. It's a highly optimistic presentation. Everything I say from here on out will be optimistic. New technologies can launch a beneficial economic transition, and there will be big advantages to the first movers, the early adopters, the early developers of solar, wind, storage, like battery technologies, and other renewables. So new technologies will become available. Second, I think highly relevant, particularly in the context of India, is that reducing greenhouse gases will bring with it enormous benefits in local air quality, local health, and the quality of the local environment. So greenhouse gas is this global problem, but greenhouse gases are often accompanied by local pollutants. And so there can be big health advantages, big environmental advantages to reducing greenhouse gases. And third, what I'm going to talk about today is that good policy design can make the reductions beneficial for the vast majority of the population. And that's what I'd like to focus on today. I'm happy to come back to any of these questions, any of these matters when we have a little discussion. So one way to encourage reduced use of carbon is to charge a price for carbon. This can be carried out in different ways. It can be taxing carbon. It can be auctioning carbon permits, saying that if you'd like to introduce carbon to the economy, every oil well, every drilling head for natural gas extraction, every oil tanker that shows up at a nation's ports has to pay a tax for the carbon content of the fuels it introduces. For the United States, there are only about 2,000 points of entry of carbon into the economy. That's not actually very difficult. It's not very difficult to envision an effective tax or permit system that would be located at those points of entry. So you won't tax every time a person turns on the light. You'll tax the energy supplier, the fossil fuel supplier, and they will need to worry about passing the cost. They will pass the cost along, but it's not an overwhelming logistical problem to tax carbon as it enters the economy. What's the point of auctioning carbon permits or charging a carbon tax? Is that a price for carbon will discourage its use. Carbon will be more expensive. Anything that has carbon embedded in it, turning on the lights has carbon embedded in it, or turning on the lights if there's a fossil fuel energy system, has carbon embedded in it. So a price for carbon will discourage its use. And that pricing will reward households, companies, and governments that reduce their carbon emissions. So we create an incentive to use less carbon. Technical term for this, if you come join us, perhaps you've already studied this in your own economic studies, is a Pigouvian tax, after the British economist Arthur Pigou, a mid-20th century, early to mid-20th century economist. It has some good principles attached. The polluter pays. If you're the party responsible for the burning of fossil fuels, which is pollution, then you pay. So it has a good moral principle attached to it. It also has a good economic principle attached to it. It creates a scarcity. It prices scarcity appropriately, and it creates a scarcity rent. There really is only a limited amount of atmosphere available to absorb carbon greenhouse gas emissions, and this means that the use of that resource now has to be paid for, and people will guard it more seriously. People will take seriously not using up the carbon absorptive capacity of the atmosphere. So this fits into a good system of shrinking the bad and growing the good through taxes. We'll encourage people anytime you adopt a renewable, you save a little bit of money for yourself. Anytime you indulge in the carbon economy, you have to pay because you are the polluter. So that sounds pretty good on charging a price for carbon. But we might worry when we charge, and in fact, let me tell you a little bit, just real briefly. I don't want to gobble up time. There are increasingly carbon pricing systems in practice. On the left side of this slide, I have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a collaboration of, I believe, 7 New England and Mid-Atlantic states, including Massachusetts, where we are this morning, or where some of us are this morning, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Connecticut, our neighboring states, have a pricing system for carbon. Companies that burn carbon, particularly in electrical energy generation, need to buy permits to introduce that carbon. It discourages the use of carbon. The European Union has introduced a carbon trading system, and you can see the price of carbon, the line going across the pages, the number of euros per ton of carbon dioxide that large European emitters have to pay. These are prices, and it discourages use. So what's the problem with pricing? The problem with pricing is not everyone can afford a higher price of carbon equally. So what I have here is data for India. This is high quality data based on the National Sample Survey, the highest quality household data collection in India. And the left-hand side breaks the Indian population into 5 groups, from the poorest, the first quintile, to the richest, the 5th quintile. And the height of the bar describes how much carbon the consumption patterns of each of those types of households emits per year. So there's a little bit of, there's good news here, which is that richer households emit more carbon. So at the moment, they're doing that for free. There is no carbon charge. If we introduced a carbon charge, richer households would pay more in a carbon tax. So that would have an equitable component if people would be charged according to their use of the atmosphere. And as it turns out, richer households use the atmosphere to absorb carbon more than poorer households do. Things like owning a car and flying use more carbon. Here's a little bit bad news. I said it was all good news here on out, but it's not yet. Although rich households use more carbon than poor households in India, rich households are also massively richer than poorer households. So if you take a look at this, there's on the order of a roughly 10-to-1 ratio between the richest fifth of households in India and the poorest fifth of households. So what's the issue here? Well, the issue is if people are paying according to their carbon use, that will be a very different pattern of payment for poor households than for rich households. Taxing carbon, unfortunately, is a regressive tax. If we had a carbon tax on the order of $50 per metric ton of carbon, that would be more or less consistent with the cost that the world bears from introducing a ton of carbon into the atmosphere. Poor households will find themselves spending almost 10% of their income on this carbon tax, an overwhelming burden because we know how we know what difficult and challenging times these are for low-income households in India. And rich households, although they will be paying more in rupees, will be paying a substantially lower share of their income, paying only about 7% of their income in a carbon tax. So you can see this is a regressive tax. Poor would pay a higher percentage of their income than would the rich. So that doesn't sound too good, but turns out we have an interesting policy mechanism that can adjust, that can make the carbon system progressive. Have a tax, indeed, price carbon, but then with the proceeds of the tax, issue equal per capita dividends. Every man, woman, and child in India would receive an equal size share of the tax revenue. So everybody would receive the tax revenue according to their common ownership of the sky. Here I have a quick summary of what that would look like. And so let me walk you through this. Again, we're going to divide the population of India into the poorest fifth, the next fifth, the richest fifth on the right. And you can see two different lines. The blue line is the amount the household would pay in tax. And the red, the blue bar, the red bar is the amount the household would receive in an equal dividend. So in an equal dividend, every household would receive about the equivalent of 100 US dollars a year. So you'd see poor households would pay in, and this would be very burdensome for poor households. They would pay in on the order of about $20 a year, very burdensome, but they would receive $100 in this carbon dividend. Rich households at the right-hand side of this would pay in about 210 US dollars per year. Not a tremendous burden for for richer households, and they would also receive the $100 carbon dividend. The net, however, for rich households would be a net payment for carbon. You can see that in the tan color, and for poor households there would be a net benefit. The pay-in would be painful, but the dividend would be substantial. It would be more than would be offsetting by manyfold. So if expressed as percentages of income, you can see that here is for poor households, here's the 10% burden of income, but that payout, because these are very poor households, the extra amount of money would be a very substantial contribution to household resources, and there'd be a net highly beneficial payment to poor households. Only households in the uppermost 20% and the next 20% would have a net payment into this system. So it would successfully provide incentives not to use carbon. Would successfully provide incentives not to use carbon, yet we would still have an equitable system, a progressive system, an egalitarian way to realize carbon reductions. This will be a substantial income support to low-income households. More than 60% of the population would see net income increases while still facing excellent incentives to reduce carbon emissions. I'm going to stop there. Thanks for your attention, and I'll be delighted to take questions and discuss at the end of the session. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Michelle. It was really, really great to hear you. The little bit I missed in between, I'm sure I'll be listening to the recording and doing that again. So we'll be taking questions at the end of the entire session. So I would now invite Professor Lenore to come and speak upon another very, very eminent issue that we're facing right now, controlling the corporate power in the context of public policy and economics. So a very, very warm welcome to you once again, Professor Lenore, and the stage belongs to you.
Great, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Can you hear me all right? Wonderful, great.
Yeah,
so
perfect.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's great to see the number of participants growing, and I hope that, you know, at some point after the pandemic lifts, we're able to all get together in person. So I am going to talk today about corporate power. The US economy and the Indian economy are obviously very different, but one thing we have in common is the importance of multinational corporations over our lives. I'm going to talk about the importance of public policies that govern how large corporations operate. These policies are critically important to combating climate change, economic inequality, and whether or not our economies are innovative and prosperous. So the premise here that I want to start with is that the laws that govern how corporations operate are publicly determined. We forget this sometimes. Many of us have been raised to think, or raised in an economic tradition that tells us that markets are simply natural, that corporations are simply efficient economic actors, and therefore the way that they operate today is obviously best. But I think it's important to step back, and I think all of us, hopefully, who study public policy can step back and think about that the laws in this case that govern how corporations operate in democratic societies are publicly determined. Now, corporations are a special type of business. They are businesses that have a whole bunch of privileges that we sometimes forget about. They have the privilege of what's called limited liability, meaning if you are, as a human actor involved in a corporation, you're not responsible for its debts. It has its own debts. It has the privilege of perpetual existence, meaning it doesn't, a corporation doesn't end when its founder dies, and other types of privileges. In a democratic society, we, the people, should set the rules that govern the trade-off between these privileges that corporations get and the responsibilities they have to the economy and to the society. So I'm going to try to talk briefly about two issues. The first is, in very broad terms, how do corporations operate today? And I'll be using the US context, but this, what I'll be talking about is common around the world. How do corporations operate today in such a way that contributes, unfortunately, to economic inequality, to the issues of climate change that Michael was just talking about, and problems of slowing down of innovation? And then I'll turn to where my recent research has focused, which is what is a new kind of framework we could use to address how corporations could operate. What are some of the public policy reforms that we have available to rebalance the role of corporations in society? So first, let me start with how they operate today. And let me just start doing my screen share. Okay, so I'll come to this. Can you see my screen now? You see a graph, great, okay. So I'll come to that graph in a minute. So what is the framework by which corporations operate today? We call this shareholder primacy. And this idea of shareholder primacy in its most basic means that the purpose of the corporation is to enrich the corporation's shareholders. This might seem like a new idea to some of you or an obvious idea to others of you, but I'm going to argue that it's actually not the best framework to use when understanding the corporation. But first, let me start by actually discussing what it means and how it operates in the US context today. So shareholder primacy claims that there's, lots of different stakeholders or actors within a corporation. There's the people who own its shares, shareholders. There's workers who show up every day and produce the goods or services that the corporation makes. There's the management, which makes the business decisions. And there's the community, really, which provides the necessary economic and social infrastructure that corporations need. Educating the future workforce, providing roads, bridges in times like this, vaccinating the population, etc. Shareholder primacy says that really the only stakeholder that matters is the shareholders. The shareholders are the ones who take a certain kind of risk, and therefore the purpose of the corporation is to enrich them, basically. So what does this mean? In the US context today, the first step of understanding the impacts of shareholder primacy is understanding who owns shares, who are the shareholders. So here I'm going to turn to a great data source that I have up on the screen share, which is our Federal Reserve's what are called distributional financial accounts. And if anyone is interested in US wealth data, this is a fantastic tool, very user-friendly, and we can certainly share it afterwards. So as we know, wealth generally in the United States is very inequitably distributed. This graph is a picture of overall wealth distributed by household wealth percentile. So we actually divide it in this case between the top 1%, the next 9%, the next 40%, and then the bottom 50%. And you might say, well, that's weird. Why not just buy 25, 25, 25, et cetera? But that's because wealth is so inequitably distributed that we actually can only see the best way to visualize who owns what is to break it out in this way. So this first graph is just a picture of overall wealth distribution. What I'm going to focus on, I told you it's very user-friendly, is the distribution between different groups by corporate equity and mutual fund shares. And just if you let your eyes look at the visual, I'll go back and forth for a second. Wealth already very inequitably distributed. Corporate equities, meaning stocks, even more inequitably distributed. You can't really see the red. The bottom half of the US population, for all intents and purposes, are not shareholders. The top 10% of the population owns about 80% of corporate equity. Now, to be totally clear, this doesn't include pension entitlements. There's some other elements that are complicated here because the financial system is more complicated. But the basic point is that shareholder primacy, if the whole purpose of the corporation is to make as much wealth as possible for shareholders, we need to recognize that who the shareholders are is very inequitably distributed. And I'll just show you for the US context, something like real estate, which is also who owns a house and who doesn't, is also inequitably distributed, but you can see the distribution is much relatively more equal than corporate equity. So let me move to the second group, and here I'll switch over. Can you now see a Google Doc? Okay, great. So let me talk about what has been the impact on the workforce. And there's lots of factors, as we all know, that impact the wages that workers get and their ability to bargain, but I'm going to focus on just a couple. In terms of the last couple of decades in the United States, corporations have continued to become more and more productive, meaning that the amount of goods and services that any given worker produces in the same amount of time has gone up, which means they're making more profit overall for the corporation, more wealth under this framework that should flow to shareholders. But what's happened is that the relationship between the productivity that an individual worker has, meaning how much, again, how much output they're producing per their effort, the relationship between that productivity and their salary, their wage, their compensation has split. And you can see this really nice graph. I apologize if it's hard to read for size, but in essence, around 1980, even though productivity continued to go up, hourly compensation, meaning wages, did not. So in other words, the effect of shareholder primacy on workers, one trend that has happened alongside the focus on shareholders has been stagnant wages for workers not benefiting as they've gotten more productive. Another trend that's happened at the same time, just to make sure we're all aware of what's gone on for the US workforce, is that the percentage of workers who are members of unions has also declined precipitously. So this, again, has many causes behind it, but it's just important to understand in terms of the picture overall of how corporations have been operating in the United States today, so that we can motivate questioning what public policies we should have moving forward. So then the question becomes, okay, we have a sense of who the shareholders are. We have a sense of what the experience has been for the workforce, who by and large are not shareholders, because much of the hourly workforce or sort of frontline workforce for corporations is in that bottom 50% of households that don't have any shares, or in that next 40% that may have some shares related to their retirement funds, but they don't hold the majority. So the next step is where is that money going? And here I won't get too deep in the weeds of corporate finance because it can take us sort of astray. But a lot of my work, if anyone is interested, I'm happy to talk later, is about, oops, one of my graphs disappeared. Sorry about that, is about the role of what are called stock buybacks, or really payments to shareholders that corporations have been prioritizing. So briefly, what this has meant is that corporations have been paying out a very high portion, in some cases 100% of their total profits, the profits that they have after they have paid sort of their basic costs, to shareholders in the form of stock buybacks and dividends. This is a really problematic corporate finance practice in particular, because it allows corporate executives to personally profit without by selling their own personal shares while they are conducting financial activities to increase the company's stock. So in other words, it allows them to personally enrich themselves, and it's completely legal. So these types of regulations that have allowed corporations to focus on enriching shareholders also allows management, senior leaders of the corporation, to make decisions in ways that can also enrich themselves. So where are these corporate profits also going? The pandemic obviously has been a horrible crisis across the globe and has contributed to necessary, in some cases, economic shutdowns. What this has meant, though, for corporations in the United States, in some cases, is that corporations did not have the rainy day funds, or sort of the funds. They had really prioritized shareholder primacy and shareholder payments so much that then they sort of claimed, even though it wasn't always true, that they could not continue to sustain their workforces. They had to lay off workers, once the pandemic really hit and they didn't have customers buying their goods and services as much. So this is a graph. I've been doing some comparison between what some of the industries that are most important to our social lives or our public health needs during the pandemic, what portion of their total funds they spent on stock buybacks before the pandemic, how much they saved laying off their workforces, and then doing some comparison between the two. I don't claim a direct kind of relationship between these two issues, but the comparison I think is just really interesting. And I'll just tell you the top line of this messy chart is that for some segments of our healthcare sector, so doctors' offices, nursing homes, residential care facilities, they spent a really large amount of money on stock buybacks before the pandemic, then laid off a significant part of their workforce. And the money that they had spent in buybacks could have, if put towards the workforce instead, kept those workers working, kept them on the payroll. Other factors we could, I'm going to stop my share here just so you can not be distracted by this graph anymore. Many other factors, of course, including climate change, the negative externalities we all pay for. We could keep going in terms of the impact of corporations on our economy and society. But let me turn in just closing to the public policies that I think we need to adopt in order to rein in corporate power. So first, I think we need to simply end this framework of shareholder primacy. We need to understand that it actually takes multiple groups of stakeholders, workers, customers, the public, as well as management and shareholders, are all necessary to make corporations productive and innovative. And I think we all need to pay attention to what drives innovation in our economies. A new framework would properly recognize the role of shareholders and other stakeholders and balance their ability to claim the profits, claim the returns that corporations create. We cannot forget the workforce. I think that's hopefully clear, the role of workers in generating the goods and services that corporations make. But we also can't forget the community. Our taxes pay for the roads, pay for the infrastructure, pay for the education that the workforce needs to be successful, that the corporation needs to be successful. So what would this framework mean in terms of corporate and labor law policies? Now, corporate and labor law is a very complicated topic in the United States, but I'll just name a couple policies briefly. The first is, I think we need to rebalance or strengthen the voice that employees have in the corporation. This can take a couple forms: increasing the ability to collectively bargain and unionize. Another approach is to increase the voice of workers on corporate boards in the business decision making of the corporation. This is common in Europe, but something that we don't have in the United States right now. Another approach is employee ownership, meaning employees actually own a share of corporate equity themselves. Another set of reforms we need is to actually mandate that the board and management of corporations consider the impact of their business decisions on multiple stakeholders. So in other words, move from their legal responsibility is just to shareholders to a framework where their legal responsibility is to consider, oh, we want to move our factory somewhere else. Oh, we're going to choose a more climate polluting production process because it's cheaper. They would legally be responsible to consider the impacts of those decisions on the workforce, the community. And then finally, I think we need to look at corporate taxation. Corporate taxation in the global context is a very important public policy issue, complicated for sure, but we need to make sure that corporations are paying their fair share of taxation as a way to share the responsibilities of the economy and the society. I think it's a very exciting time, though certainly a challenging one, to think about the public policies that govern the relationship between corporations, workers, and the society. And I hope that all of you who are going to go into many different areas of public policy take a fresh look at whatever work you end up doing at how corporations should be interacting with the economy and the society. Thanks very much for having me, and I really look forward to the conversation to come.
Thank you very much. Something very, very prevalent right now in India, a very hot issue. So it was really important for us to understand it. And your perspective on and data, especially in the US situation, has been really, really important. We have a few questions now, which we would like to take up. I would switch off my screen so that the network works better. The first question we take up is for you and Professor Lenore, it's for you. So the question is, in light of your presentation, kindly shed some light on corporate social responsibility. It's a thing in India that some enterprises, some corporates above certain turnover have to contribute to a social welfare cause. So which has been mandated in India. So does it absolve private players and should it be mandated or voluntary?
Great question. Thank you very much for that. And I would really welcome the opportunity to learn more about how this policy has evolved in India and what the impacts have been, because I'm not, I certainly know far less about it than all of you. I would say my position is that we actually really need any reforms to public policy to be mandatory. That's because you may have some corporations who, for enlightened reasons or market share reasons, want to market themselves as being good for the environment or being productive, conscious members of society. However, you also would have bad actors, and we need to lay even playing fields in terms of the responsibilities that corporations have towards society. So in terms of social responsibility, I think that this new framework, and sometimes we call it stakeholder capitalism, inclusive capitalism, it's really exciting that the conversation is moving in this direction. But I think public policies need to be mandatory to lay a clear framework.
That's very insightful. Thank you. The next question we have is from Deepika Garg. The question says, what is the most probable reason for the uneven shareholdings? Is it risk-taking appetite or lack of knowledge of lower income group?
Another great question. So wealth is intergenerational. And if you don't have enough income to meet your daily needs or meet your family's needs and have enough left over to buy stock, you're not going to be a shareholder. So on the first reason, much of our wealth, in India, in the United States, around the world, is passed down through the generations. If you come from a family that already owns wealth, you are going to inherit some, or you're going to be able to build up wealth earlier in your life. That's a major part of the reason why we see ownership of stock so concentrated. Another is the relationship between income inequality and wealth inequality, meaning that if you have income that you're able to save and turn into wealth, you are first probably going to prioritize things like a home or other more safe savings. So the question about risk is certainly a part of the equation. But I would say it's not lack of knowledge. I would say it's lack of access. And in many cases, markets can go up, but markets can certainly go down. And so the risk approach that people have may in the long run be correct to really focus on those safer assets until they have the ability to invest in riskier assets. But I think it's really a question of inequality more than lack of knowledge.
Great. Next question that we have, we would take it from Misha Kakkar. Question says, do you think political funding plays a key role in how we shape our policies? Do corporates funding political parties? Is it easy to go around and do something which might not be beneficial to certain industries?
Michael, do you want to address that? Because you've certainly thought a lot about this question.
Yeah, I think it's an open question. Like any of our speakers can definitely take it up.
Sorry, I had trouble hearing. Is this Manisha's question?
Yes, the political fundraising question.
Yes, yes, it is.
Yeah. Well, so I think I'm going to defer to Lenore. I mean, I know only what I've read in, sort of popular takes about, the United States has a really disastrous political funding system. It has gone from bad to worse. I think Lenore is better equipped than I to talk about things like Citizens United, this Supreme Court of the United States ruling that vastly increased the scope for corporate engagement in politics. I think I can only tell you I have kind of personal negatives, but I think Lenore will have a more scientific and analytic take on it. If I can.
No, I think that's exactly the correct response. And without going into more detail, I think, yes, of course, it's a problem. And the ability of corporations to spend lots of their own funds on both supporting candidates and then lobbying, in some cases, is even more important to try to change how regulations are put forward that affect their behavior. That has an incredibly important role in how the economy develops, for sure.
There's a question in the chat box that I think could go to both of you. It's from anonymous
That's very,
attendee.
very true. Yeah.
And the question from anonymous attendee.
Yeah, actually, yeah, I was reading that.
I think goes to 2 points. The first is basically about the challenge, I think, of implementing policy, especially in the Indian context, that is making sure it works at ground level. And then the second question, it goes to the economic turmoil that India is witnessing today, I think probably partly aggravated by the pandemic, and the question of the viability of pursuing reforms. And I think this goes for either of your topics, the question of implementation and also the effect on the economy. Would you like to talk about maybe how much those factors shape your thinking about policy in the American context, or if you want to speculate about the Indian context?
I can say briefly, I think that the policies, in many cases, the best ideas and the best momentum for passing new policies come from when you have energy at the civil society level. So a very brief example I can give is that there's an organization of Walmart workers in the United States that has been advocating heavily for worker representation on the Walmart board of directors. And that's a great example where workers are seeing their own issues of wages and other issues that they have in terms of Walmart's treatment of them, and saying, we have a solution. I think that in terms of the economic turmoil that certainly India is witnessing, we're having a major debate right now in the United States about how to support our citizens through the pandemic. And I think I'm really excited to see the move away from a focus on austerity politics. I think that's something that the whole globe is grappling with as we deal with the pandemic. But certainly, I think while I would not say that corporate governance policies are the first issue to deal with in a public health crisis, I think we need public support for people in this time of severe economic need. I do think that it's a good moment to really refocus on what is the purpose of economic policy, who should it serve, and then take our approach going from that, from the answer to those questions going forward. So
I will comment briefly on this question, and then I'd like to address Rahul's question, which I think is very well put. So the brief comment on this is, I think we're in one of the most frustrating policy environments that kind of we could imagine. That and if you think about the policy that the carbon taxation policy that I described, these are policies that are designed to benefit the many, and it remains remarkably hard to move such policies forward. I mean, I think we're having not just a crisis of policy and implementation, but really a crisis of democracy, because you think about these policies that might benefit 95% of the population with a modest cost to the other five, or might even be nearly universal. And the ability for powerful interests to veto those policies, I find shocking. Let me pivot and address Rahul's question about I think the question, if I understand it, is isn't taxation onerous? That any tax is a question of enforcement and onerousness. One of the things I find very, very engaging and intriguing about the carbon taxation is that really it is a case of us collectively enforcing a payment for the use of our common resource, the atmosphere. So it is not, I think I encourage you not to think of it as the government as coming and enforcing or taking blood money, but really a collective saying, we only have a limited amount of atmosphere to go around. We want to protect that common resource. And if you think about the revenue recycling, the notion is, again, these are not funds disappearing to some mysterious activity over there. All of the funds are coming back to us as the collective holders, as the collective generational guarantors of the environment. So so I would really encourage a reframing of this. I don't object to using the word tax. I'm happy to call it a carbon tax, but it's really a tax that we as a collective are using to enforce the quality, to maintain the quality of this common pool resource, the environment, and we are using its proceeds to enable a better and more egalitarian and more environmentally protected future. So I hope that's a useful answer. That again, I think we should think very hard about how we implement taxes. But if we do think about this as building a commons, and many taxes, taxes for training, many charges are really the price we pay for civilization, and we should do that as collectively as possible. That was a great question. Thanks, and please let me know if I've addressed it in the way that you had in mind.
Palak, will I turn it back to you? Why don't we, perhaps we've got two more questions from here. One from Abhinav. One is about how can we work toward economic development and promote social policy at our level? This is, I guess, a question that goes to how do you affect change? Would either of the panelists like to address that question? Michael, do you want to say a word about that? Or?
I mean, I can say I'm not totally sure what is meant here by at our level, but if it's meant sort of at where you are in the educational process, then I would say keep going. The best way to affect economic development and social policy is to have, I think, people who are thoughtful and open-minded and also rigorous approaching public policy questions. I think if the question is more meant at sort of at a broad-based level, then I think that we do need to, despite the real challenges that Michael spoke about sort of dominance over our politics, I think we need to continue to push for all of the representatives and decision makers we have in our countries to take the interests of the majority of us into account.
Maybe I could just sort of elaborate that and turn it over to you, Michael. I guess part of the question too is the other way of interpreting at our level means sort of down at the grassroots. I'm wondering also in big federal systems like India or the United States, how much of the solutions to the problems we're describing hinges on action by the federal government, and how much progress could be made by pursuing action at lower and more accessible levels of government?
Yeah, so I don't think I have any special knowledge to add. I will defer to my colleagues. I will remark on, so a question is, I think it's carbon pricing utopian, or is it really coming into play? I would answer that carbon pricing, it's very clear we need more than carbon pricing. If you look, I gave a text answer to somebody who said, well, what do you think about, government investment instead? My answer is it's not an either or. I think that that we obviously need robust public investment in renewables and efficiency. This cannot, I want to be clear and on the record, the energy transition cannot be carried out exclusively through carbon pricing. It is going to require investment, probably public investment, almost certainly public investment to effect the transition. That said, carbon pricing can play an important role, and especially if it is done what I think of as right, with this equitable return of the proceeds, it can be a very important bridge to make it possible for households. It is becoming a reality. California has carbon pricing. As I mentioned, 7 New England and Mid-Atlantic states in the United States have carbon pricing. The entire European Union has carbon pricing. So I think carbon pricing is coming into its own. There are better and worse implementations. Carbon pricing is not a cure-all panacea. And in general, I think the prices have been too low to set adequate incentives to do enough carbon reduction. But I do think it's a reality, and that we are at this point adjusting the parameters and not asking, is carbon pricing a part of the answer? That is my sense.
Great. Palak, can I turn it over back to you?
Hi, I guess my network is going to be unstable, so I guess if Al, you could carry for.
Oh, certainly. Thank you. Well, I'd like to just wrap up by saying thank you to Michael and Lenore for 2 fascinating presentations. Wonderful sort of pocket summaries of 2 very complex policy issues. And I think it gives an illustration of the range of policy challenges that we address in the field of public policy, and the immense importance of the problems that we're tackling, these complex questions that really can affect human welfare and the quality of life in a profound way. So, and I would like to also thank JKLU for the opportunity to participate in this lecture series, this partnership. We have 1 more lecture to come, and there will be more details about that forthcoming. But I think for the moment, we will adjourn. Thanks again to our speakers. Thanks to all of the participants who joined us this morning. I hope that you all have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time.
Oh, if I can just say,
Michael.
it was such a pleasure to be in conversation with you. The questions were so thoughtful. Thank you for including me. And I look for my email was on my slides. I don't know. I will send a link to my slides to the question and answer. I don't know if that's useful. And I'm delighted to continue the conversation with anyone who would like to. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be present.
Agree.
Wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.
Wonderful. Have a good evening. See you all.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye-bye.